So I see Chuck is now here. Oh, he just muted himself again. But now that all three of you are here, do you want me to go quickly through the pre-meeting?
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you now, Chuck.
Yes, if you could do that, Will, thank you.
Yeah, give me 2 seconds to pull them.
Will?
Yes, Chuck. Can you hear us? Chuck, can you hear me? Somebody give me a thumbs up if you can hear me.
Can you hear me? Hello?
We can hear you.
Chuck, can you hear us?
Hear you, Will. I don't think Chuck can hear us.
Let me chat him really quickly.
Okay.
Chuck, can you hear us yet?
No, I can't hear you. I can't hear you for some reason.
While Chuck is figuring that out, I'm going to really quickly read the pre-meeting introductions. So welcome, everybody. If this is your first time joining us for one of our virtual community board committee meetings, everyone will remain muted throughout the meeting except for the committee co-chairs, Rebecca and Taina and Chuck. And following the beginning of the conversation, the co-chairs will be able to call on members of the public wishing to speak. If you would like to participate in the meeting, go to the reactions icon at the bottom of your screen and press the raise hand button. Don't hit the wave button or the thumbs up, those things disappear. And you should only press the raise hand button once. If you hit it a second time, your hand will go back down and we will not see you. If you're calling in from the phone, it's *9 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute. Be on the lookout for a prompt asking you to confirm unmuting once the co-chairs call on you. The chat is only for technical support with the Zoom software. It is not to ask questions of the co-chairs or make comments about anything that is being said or discussed during the meeting. If you're using an older version of Zoom, you'll need to go to the participants section where you'll find the raise hand feature there. And please do not raise your actual hand or wave at the screen because we may not be able to see you. Chat me, I'm here for your support. Chuck, can you hear us yet? Oh wait, did he disappear?
I think so.
Oh, he muted himself.
Yeah, can people hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear. I'm fine.
Perfect.
Okay. So can we'll call a meeting to order here? I'd like to welcome people to meeting of the Rules and Bylaws Committee. I'm Chuck Warren, the co-chair, and we have two new co-chairs, and I'm pleased to introduce Taina Barrero and Rebecca Dangor, and glad to have them. And just wanted to make a couple of opening comments, and I'll have the co-chairs make some comments also. Obviously, the committee hasn't met in quite a while, and this year Russell appointed two new co-chairs, and we talked and we decided that one thing to look at is something that's been an issue over the last couple of years, and that's why we put this item on the agenda. It's really an organizational item. It doesn't have anything to do with any particular applications or anything like that, but we thought it was something that worth discussing, and checked with our board chair, Russell, who I'm glad to see is here. And Russell thought it made sense to get it on the agenda and just talk about it. And so I think we can have a good discussion and see what happens. We may not come to any particular conclusions today, but I think we'll have a good discussion. And I'll turn it over to my co-chairs, and then I'll come back and talk about the history as I've put it together and as I remember it. So
Great.
why don't I go ahead? If Tiny, do you want to go ahead and
Sure.
I want to say a couple things, and then we'll go to Rebecca.
Great. Thanks so much, Chuck. Excited for everyone to join us tonight. Thank you to my fellow community board members and members of the public. Echoing everything Chuck said, I'm excited to have what I hope is a productive discussion. And just as a reminder, our discussion this evening will be specifically about the scope and jurisdiction of the zoning and development and land use committees. We just want to reiterate that this committee is by no means trying to discuss sort of, the validity of either of these committees or whether they should exist. We've sort of heard, that folks had that concern. So we just want to take those concerns off the table and make it clear that the specific discussion this evening is limited and exclusive to just discussion of the scope and jurisdiction of these two committees. And to the extent where there has been either, contradiction or overlap, discussion, productive discussion about that. And so I'll turn it over to Rebecca to share a little more context on that.
Yeah, and thank you all for coming as well. Essentially, we've seen at certain meetings issues of jurisdiction when it comes to certain resolutions come up. And this is really just a discussion to kind of resolve that or attempt to and save time by not having to repeat the same disagreements over and over. So we look forward to an enlightening discussion.
Good.
Back to Chuck.
Let me just mention a few things. When I knew we were going to have this discussion, I wanted to go back and check on whether my memory was correct, because I was not here when the zoning and the land use committee was created, a committee of the whole. But I went back, but I had heard, I got on the board shortly thereafter, and I heard about it, how it was created, but I wanted to check that. And so I went back to someone that I think a number of people may know, but a number of people may not know, and that's Hetty White, who is a longtime board member and also a board chair. And she's been off the board for a while now, but I went back to her to ask her if she remembered how this had come about. And she sent me, and I want to just read what she sent me here. And she said, yes, I remember very clearly how this came about. When I joined the board in 1982, the full board meeting was the only meeting of the whole and required attendance by all. Zoning and development items were considered by what was then the Zoning and Development Committee, sounds familiar, which was chaired by Edith Fisher, whom a number of us may know who've been around, but and reported at the full board meeting. However, during those years, the development activity in our district became very intense, and almost every project was a ULURP requiring a public hearing. It was not unusual for 2, even 3 applications to be reported at the monthly board meeting. It was not unusual for the monthly meeting to go on until well after midnight. The public sessions were a big part of that. It was also very hard to get to any other committee's business. When Connie Adamek, and Connie became chair, and she was chair actually when I first got on the board, she decided to address the issue. There was enough full board work to be done that she decided to add a second required full board monthly meeting. Importantly, she also determined that zoning and development applications and items should be heard by the full board, a committee of the whole, and as such, the board chair should preside. In order to have the flexibility to assign other committees to be heard at this second board meeting, like landmarks, she named the second full board required meeting land use to indicate the theme of the second meeting. Because the New York City Charter requires only 1 full board meeting per month, the chair has the ability not to schedule a land use meeting if the month's agenda could be handled at 1 meeting. And as we know, that sometimes we only do have 1 full board meeting. I followed Connie as chair and continued the new organization of meetings. There you have it. And I think obviously, as we know, this was sometime between 1982 and 1985 when this was done, and it's continued up to the present time. Then in around 1998, when Barry Schneider, who I see is here, was the board chair, the Zoning and Development Committee was created. And as I remember it, and Barry confirmed as he remembered it, the idea was to look at sort of generic types of zoning issues that community-wide, and not to look at specific projects. And so that was how we remembered it. And Barry agreed that was his idea in forming it. And so there you have sort of the history of it. And obviously that's something we can discuss and see whether or not in today's world, that's something that makes sense, or there's some adjustments that ought to be made. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over and see, I don't know if we have any public members of the public rather that would like to comment on this. And I see someone, Marty Bell. Is that, Will, do you see anyone else in the public that wants to do that? I'm sure we'll have a lot of board members that want to comment.
Not yet. I'll also remind that if you'd like to comment or make a question, you need to find the raise hand feature under the reactions button at the bottom of your screen. And if you're on the phone, it's *9 to raise your hand. And if you're using an older version of Zoom, you'll want to find the participants button to find the raise hand.
And I think maybe right before turning to members of the public, if we want to give Russell a chance to say something quickly to kind of finish opening up the meeting.
Sure. Russell, yeah, please. Anything you would like to say at this point?
Sure. So I guess, yeah, I'll try to be brief here. Obviously, we're here to discuss what I think is sort of a thorny issue, and it's a tough question. I'm just kind of sort of trying to figure out how to have this stuff work out and what the sort of different jurisdictions should be kind of going forward. And really the goal is to have a discussion and to get the views of, different people, and basically just sort of figure out what the preferred approach of the board is in terms of how we should handle these things going forward. I think it's been, I think there's probably an understanding of kind of what the issue is, but just to sort of state it a little more clearly, in case some aren't familiar, basically there's this sort of anomalous situation where when you have applications or requests to change zoning, those are, all of those will come to the land use committee, but then there's this sort of unusual situation where some of them will be heard by the zoning and development committee. It's sort of at that committee's discretion, and there's not really anything else like that. There's no other kind of similar circumstance with any other type of application, right? Like landmarks, here's every landmark application. There's no other committee that sort of decides to come in and also hear those, and same thing with street life, et cetera, et cetera. So that's sort of the kind of anomalous situation that we're trying to address. And obviously, I think the other point of this that's important is, I do think it's important, obviously, like ULURP applications will come to the land use committee and we'll hear them there. But I think for big projects, it is the case that there should be in my opinion, that we do need a way to look at those and examine those before the ULURP process has started. I think the way that that's been handled, it's been handled in different ways in the distant past and in the sort of recent past and the very recent past. And so I think really the question is ultimately, just to get everybody's views and kind of hear what people think about these issues and what people think is the right way to kind of solve this and move forward. So that's that I think is some more of my thoughts on just kind of giving an overview of what the issue is. And with that, I'll turn it back to the chairs here.
Thank you, Russell. Do I see Marty Bell, I think, is a member of the public. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah, he is able to unmute himself now.
Yeah. Why doesn't he unmute himself? And
I am unmuted.
Okay, Mr. Bell, why don't you?
Hi, I've got just 3 comments.
Sure.
One is, while I understand this is the Rules Committee, when I looked at the bylaws of Community Board 8, I see that the jurisdiction of the standing committees is actually something that the full board should address, not the Rules Committee. It's very clear. It's Article 5, Section A, standing committees. The board from time to time may determine jurisdiction of such committees. So it seems this should be, it may well be a good and timely discussion, but I think this is the wrong forum.
Well,
Secondly,
could I just interrupt you for 1 second, Mr. Bell, for your first point? Sure. Listen, the way we operate it as a board, no committee has the final say on anything. If we were to develop a resolution, that would have to go to the full board. So, I mean, obviously, we're not arrogating some kind of jurisdiction saying we're the decider here. We just would, to the extent that anything comes out of this committee, it would have to be approved by the full board, and we would never say otherwise. So I think that's the way the board operates in every committee, and we operate the same way. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
That sounds like a very convincing argument for maintaining the zoning committee doing what it does and then having it go to the full board. So I appreciate that thought, because I think that's, it's interesting that you're looking at this now, but as you read the history, it was, 25 years ago that this bifurcation was established, and it's been functioning up until now. And it's, maybe I'm old fashioned, but if it ain't broke, it seems, it's interesting that people say, oh no, this has nothing to do with any pending matter, but other people may be more suspicious. Also, 2 other points, as I said. One is I went back over the last 2 years, just in terms of the functioning of the zoning committee, and that it seems to be getting stuff done. I looked at every meeting and how long it was. And over the last 2 years, going back to September 19th, I think, the average length of a zoning committee meeting was 2 hours and 47 minutes. So it seems like there's some significant merit to that committee being maintained. And finally, I appreciate, Russell, what you said about, pre-Euler, there's a purpose for the zoning committee, because again, just as I was sort of researching this, I don't know how it came up, but when I was looking online, I saw, Russell, your interview with CB8 Speaks on, let's see, when was it? November 3rd. And someone asked you specifically the question about the committees, and you were very emphatic saying that the committees, you think the way the committees are all structured and the way they work should be maintained, and wouldn't be proposing any change to that. So I appreciate that, and what you just said about, when it gets to ULURP, then it could be a land use committee, but before then, there are certainly the zoning aspects to be addressed. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bell.
Yeah, just to clarify, I mean, I think the question is
Yeah.
what the mechanism should be for those sort of pre-ULURP discussions. I think that's really what we're looking at.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Bell. Are there any other members of the public? I don't see any. Do you see any, Will, at this point?
You do have one more who just raised her hand, Wendy McIver.
Oh, yes, sorry. I see that. Yes. Yes, Wendy McIver. Why don't we unmute Wendy?
Hi, thank you all so much. What an interesting discussion. I wanted to say that these 2 committees may seem to have overlapping interests. I think that the idea of how we use our small municipal space in all the 5 boroughs is of vital interest. It affects every aspect of our life. It affects, our street safety. It affects our environmental protections. It affects our economy. It affects workers who don't work in fancy high-rise buildings and might be automated out of existence. It affects people who do work in high-tech or high profession jobs. This is a vital issue to our community. I see zoning very differently than land use. For example, land use considered in recent months, coastal flooding resiliency, bike structures being put in place. Corey Johnson's plan, where zoning is talking about the very regulations that permits certain types of buildings to be built in certain areas. Once that is taken care of, then the actual use of those particular regulations seems to fall under the purview of land use. As a member of the public, I have to say that I am a SIMBY, that is SIMBY. I want sensible development in my backyard. We definitely need development and construction and innovation. And sometimes that's going to be a little controversial, and we might love to have old-fashioned looking buildings or modern looking buildings. That's really not the purview of what these two committees do. But we also need to have some eye on what protects the public. There's an enormous amount of power in development and in big money and in big investments, but the person on the street really has no such power. And that's where CB8 comes in. This is the voice of people, and the structures that are in place really should be augmented rather than thinking of limiting or consolidating. We need more of, not less than, because we have many development issues coming before us, and there should actually be a healthy and constructive dialogue between developers and landlords and the neighborhoods and constituents to further going along. We're not going to stay stuck in the 1600s. We're not going to have huts and what did my kids study in school? The longhouses. That's not appropriate anymore. But we also can't have everybody kicked out and removed to remote areas. We can't have climate change pollution taking over and causing flooding that requires billions of dollars in remediation rather than a tenth of that to stop it from happening. So I'm hoping that you are going to strengthen these two committees in their individual mandates and certainly not consider consolidating or removing any of their power. It's very chilling to think that the very structure that's supposed to represent the voice of the people might actually be serving a very different interest. And I very much appreciate your listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McAvoy. I think we have Maggie Lehman, also a public member. Why don't we unmute Ms. Lehman?
Thank you. Can I be heard?
Yes, you can.
Thanks for having this meeting tonight. And Russell, I too appreciated your remarking that you felt that prior to Euler, particularly with big projects, it would be important to have review and commentary. We're discussing the zoning committee tonight, and I don't have much to add to the prior speaker. She was extraordinarily eloquent. The very little bit that I would add would be that the committees, all of them, but we're discussing the zoning committee tonight, is our chance as the public to have some meaningful and significant impact. It's our chance to be able in a zoning committee meeting to be informed about increasingly complicated zoning matters. We have before us as the public, and I talk about Community Board 8 and the public as one, because you are our voice. You are a community board, and you are responsive to the public. You need to be, that's your job, of course, but it is a committee meeting and a committee review, particularly in face of the two enormous projects that are before us now. Immediately, the blood center, which hasn't started its ULURP process yet. This is the zoning committee meeting is our chance to be educated by the zoning committee, to be informed of complicated zoning matters, to ask questions of, and then to give meaningful impact. We lose that opportunity if in any way the jurisdiction and scope of the zoning committee is in any way lessened. And I absolutely echo the prior speaker's comment that if anything, we'd like to see it enhanced. I'll end with simply the Blood Center Longfellow's request isn't for zoning variance, it's for a rezoning. Even more reason to have zoning committee review before ULURP. After the ULURP process, we're reactive. And you never, never as a public and as a community board want to be in a position where you're being reactive, not proactive. Thanks for the time.
Thank you, Ms. Lehman. I'm just trying to see if there's any, I don't see any.
I didn't see
other-
anyone else. I think everyone else is-
Anthony Barrett.
Yeah, the last one up.
Oh, sorry, just came Anthony Barrett. Yes, thank you. Thanks, Rebecca. Yes, can we unmute Anthony Barrett, please? Yes.
I
Mr.
think
Barrett.
I'm unmuted. I'd just like to add to that, you know, over the years, I've not been that involved with the community board as a public member, but just in the last few months, dealing directly on the blood center issue, I'd like to add that I've been nothing but impressed by the quality and the knowledge of the parties on the zoning committee, and feel that if we lose that, it would be of great detriment to the community. The time and effort that they put in to explain the nuances and the issues involved is something that helps the community as a whole. And I believe for any project of this size and complexity, it is necessary to keep those experts available where the public can benefit from that. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Did we see anyone else now? Did we miss anyone
I
before?
just went through and no, everyone remaining is a community board member.
Okay, thank you.
Wait, Andrew,
Actually,
sorry, Andrew Ravishir has his hand up.
Oh, okay. Oh, Andrew Ravishir, okay. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for recognizing me. And also, I'm so impressed that you said my name correctly, because that is not easy. And before I have my coffee, I don't even say my name correctly. So that was great. Just to piggyback off the last speaker, I think as we have these monster tall projects proposed in our area, the more times we can have people either for or against these projects in the public record is better. So even if there's overlapping jurisdiction between zoning and land use, the more testimony, the more public sessions that we could have in which members of the community show up in the large numbers that we've seen, where it's almost 300 people saying yes or no on a project. Not only do we bring in more people when there are more meetings, just because sometimes due to people's work and home schedules, they can make one but not the other, but the more records and established testimony that we have, the better. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else from the public? I don't see anyone. Does anybody else see? No.
No, we're good.
Why don't we go to the board members and we'll take them in order, and the first one I see is Alita Camp, just immediate past chair. Can we unmute Alita?
That's right. And that's exactly why I'd like to explain what my thinking was when both first you, Chuck, and then Barry raised the inappropriateness of having a zoning committee look at first the hospital, the Northwell Hospital plant expansion, and then the blood center plant expansion, becoming the Longfellow Commercial Tower. And my thinking was that, like any other committee, the zoning committee had a lot of issues with these buildings, and the buildings presented a lot of issues, not just for the zoning committee, but potentially for transportation. If you look at the ambulances and the trucks for Northwell, if you look at what's going to happen with the school buses and the corridor to the hospitals in front of the Longfellow building, the Youth Education and Libraries Committee could be looking, for example, at the impact of Longfellow on JREC, the Parks Committee with the impact on St. Catherine's. There were a lot of committees, even the small business with the impact on small businesses in the neighborhood. The zoning committee is a specialized committee whose chairs are, if not quite experts, certainly very close to experts and experienced people with the art of zoning, which, as we all know, especially now, is much more complicated and much more difficult to understand. There are a lot of overlays in special districts and historic districts and different ways of or different categories for zoning. So it makes sense to have had the meetings at the zoning committee to examine these projects from the very beginning and then provide input to the full board. If we wait till ULURP, we never would have been able to have any input at all into the scoping session. And right the day before my term finished, or maybe even the day that my term finished, I think it was New Year's Eve, we prepared 34 pages of material on the scoping session because the Longfellow project affected every 19 of the 20 seeker categories. That never would have been able to, I never would have been able to do that without having seen the presentation from the Blood Center and Longfellow, and having had the experience of understanding what the questions were that were coming from the chairs of the zoning committee. So that's why I thought it was appropriate to have these projects heard first at the zoning committee. It gives the public a great chance to be heard. Over 200 members showed up in opposition to the Longfellow project in November and in December, and there's no equivalent opportunity at a meeting of the full board for the first time. So it seems to be urgent to have these matters heard first and frequently as much as possible, because they have an enormous impact far beyond, it seems, and based on what the public was saying and based on what a lot of board members were saying, beyond what the initial exposure to the project might indicate or might suggest. These projects have all of the resources almost in the world. They have, Chuck, they have your firm for Longfellow, which is the preeminent land use firm in the city, I believe. You should pat yourself on the back. They have Casira, who's the lobbyist, and the PR firm, who is also the preeminent lobbyist for developers in the city. They have prominent architects, prominent engineers. They have, in fact, they are so well loaded with the ability to hire experts that it's very difficult for groups, not the community board, but for groups to hire oppositional experts, such as lawyers or PR people, because they don't want to oppose these projects. So the zoning committee is an opportunity not just for the public to be heard, but for people to be able to look at this and have a voice that is much harder to balance with the powerful voices of the developers and these projects. So that was my thinking. I have not changed my mind. It's essential to have for the opportunity to be able to prepare for scoping sessions and anything else that comes before the city, and for the opportunity for the public to be heard and the board members to be heard. I don't see an overlap, because once the zoning committee and any other committee that feels it's appropriate weighs in and they're coming to ULURP, then it's an opportunity to have this heard at the land use meeting and have the ULURP aspect of it heard. But these projects are just way too big to give, and the interests behind them are way too powerful for the board to step aside and say, no, we will look at this in a great big meeting where we don't have the opportunity to do a deep dive and to understand exactly what's being asked. I've taken up a lot of time of this. That goes to be the passion with which I feel that the zoning committee is the most appropriate place to hear these, not to hear the application, because that's for the land use committee, but to see the project as it evolves and to be able to have feedback. I know that that Barry or you, or maybe both of you, Chuck, suggested having a task force that only works if the project developers are interested in meeting and hearing a community voice. And so far, neither the Blood Center, Longfellow, nor Northwell have indicated any interest in the community's input or the community board's input. So this is our chance to hear. So thank you.
Just for the context, the mansion, I think, was also another item that there might have been some conflict about whether it was in the jurisdiction of zoning and development or land use. Although that was a much more positive discussion.
Since Alita talked about me a few times, I don't want to talk about development projects. That's for others to discuss. But I will say in general that I've always objected to the idea of, if it's a transportation project where we have jurisdiction in the transportation committee, of having other committees come in and pass resolutions which might be in conflict with the resolution that comes out of the committee which has the main jurisdiction. And so I think, as a general rule, forgetting about development projects, we'll talk about that. As a general rule, I don't think that's an appropriate way for the board to do business, but that's all I want to say.
I don't believe that I was suggesting that. I think that the zoning committee is a part, what they look at, these ULURP projects.
No, let's not talk about that. Let's not talk about that. I don't want to get in that discussion right now, Alita, but in the past, as you know, and I don't want to waste a lot of the committee's time. We had a situation that had to do with bus stops, and another committee came in and passed a resolution on bus stops when it was clearly a transportation thing, and I objected to that. And I continue to object to those kinds of things. And the zoning stuff we'll talk about, but I'm talking about just in general as a policy. But again, I don't think we should argue that now. I just want to respond since you had mentioned me that, before.
I didn't think I was arguing that, but okay.
Okay. Maybe you weren't. So let's go to Peter Patch next. Peter, why can't we unmute Peter?
I'm still waiting to hear what the problem is, because there actually is one. We seem to be having a discussion in search of a problem. A few points I'd like to make. First of all, this is an exercise in democracy, and democracy is inherently a bit messy. So if it's a bit messy, that to me is actually the way it should look, because what we're trying to do in any sort of democratic process is put on the table and reconcile different parties with different interests representing our community, different information sets, and sort of different decision mechanisms. And the Zoning and Development Committee in particular deals with, several large projects that have large impacts. They obviously have large interest in the community. And so I think that's a useful mechanism. And as others have already pointed out, to have almost 300 people show up means it's dealing with weighty issues that the community really cares about. I also don't really see a problem with regard to this issue of jurisdiction. I mean, that, with all due respect, sounds like an attorney speaking, and I'm not a trained attorney, even though the standard test said I was supposed to be one. To me, to be with these large projects with large impacts, the opportunity to get input and to provide input and insight sooner than later is all to the good. And if there turns out that one committee decides it's within their jurisdiction, another one has a different point of view, it'll all come up to the full board. So there's every opportunity to reconcile it in the body that ultimately should be making those decisions, which is the full board. I don't see the problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Valerie Mason, I believe is next.
Hi. Chuck, I want to just say thank you for that very useful oral history of the committees, because one of the things, and I think Marty pointed to this, is that, the bylaws say that the standing committees and the jurisdiction should be done by the board itself. And so when I saw the announcement for this meeting, I tried to go back and see if there were actual resolutions establishing the many standing committees we have. And I think the conclusion is that even though the bylaws say that they're supposed to be voted on by the full board, it seems to me that the practice has long been that it's basically done by the chair of the board with some discussion, and it's never memorialized anywhere. So I don't know if that's something that should be actually discussed with respect to all of our committees, so we don't have to go relying on oral history. And again, I commend you for doing that to find out why we have the committees we have and what they're supposed to do. So that may be a more long-range project to actually focus on, especially because we do have term limits now, and we're not going to have all of that great history and long-term at least appointed board support. Obviously, when people roll off, I hope they will stay involved in the community board as just regular old public members. But my point is that I think from listening to what you said and what I tried to glean from looking at the descriptions on our website is that I apologize, I forget the former chair you quoted, they called it the Land Use Committee, but what they were really forming was a supplemental second full board meeting so that board meetings weren't lasting 10 or 12 hours.
Yes.
And the way it's actually referred to on our website, it says land use and has jurisdiction over other committees. So it seems, even the way it's been historically or orally put together on the website, the concept really is that if the agenda for the full board becomes too voluminous and too substantive, that we'd never get it done. That's why it's a committee of the whole, and it's really meant so that we can have a full discussion
on all the issues that come up before the community. I mean, I think though that it makes sense for the ULURP, when we start the ULURP, to be in a committee of the whole, because ultimately all of the board will have to vote on it, and it is something that people have to attend. But I think, to Peter's point, if it ain't broken, don't fix it. The zoning committee seems to be working very well in terms of addressing issues before they come to ULURP and giving it time for the community to fully participate and vet issues. So I don't think there's a problem with how it's set up. I mean, one of the questions I have for you, I think Rebecca pointed out when we were looking at Mansion Diner, I think that was in the zoning committee.
Oh, it was actually scheduled at a land use committee, and then it was taken off the day of or the day before that land use committee to be held at a zoning committee.
Right, and I think that was the appropriate thing to do because it is a zoning issue. And I think I disagree somewhat with Russell, who said that zoning issues are more appropriate in land use. Again, I think maybe land use has sort of overtaken what that committee is really. It's probably better to call it supplemental full board meeting, which has as its jurisdiction ULURP and any other matter that would seem to have to go to that when the chair of the board looks at the discussion that's going to be had, when it comes out of a smaller committee that we know we're going to need a lot of time for, to have two full board meetings. So again, I think that the zoning committee is operating just fine. I think, to your point, Chuck, I think there have been a number of issues that span multiple committees. I think one of them actually is safe haven, to cite a recent example, and that we need to be perhaps more diligent when matters come before the board in general as to whether they are multi-jurisdictional or start in one place, but make sure that multiple committees have hearings to address various issues. But I don't think that there's any need to change what zoning is doing. I think perhaps a better, maybe we change the title of the land use committee, because to me, when I look at it and the way I've seen it been used, it is really a supplemental full board meeting. So that's
Mallory,
that.
thank you. Just a couple of points. You're correct that the board chair has been the one that has, formed some of these committees, and it does. The bylaws do say that the chair can create special committees and stuff like that.
Right,
But as far as standing committees, it's supposed to be the board, but the board chair has done it, as you've said. That's correct. And normally the way it's worked in the past is that when items get put on the agenda, the board chair looks it over and decides if it's in the right committee. I mean, obviously, and sometimes you can have joint, if we do all the time, you can have joint items. The question is, what committee does the resolution come out of? And that's with across the board. I'm not talking about, zoning, we're talking zoning, setting that aside, but I mean, just as across the board. But going back to as Hetty was saying, going back to the Hetty White, they called it land use because in those days, land use was considered all kinds of zoning stuff. Plus they could, if you needed to do like a landmarks issues or street life, we used to have street life a lot in the land use committee, because you were a committee of the whole and you could do those things there, and that took some pressure off the main board meeting. But anyway, that's just sort of the history. But your main point, one of your main points is right. I mean, the board chair has done that.
Well, I appreciate that, but let me ask you, since you touched on that, I don't really see in the bylaws that the chair has the power to set the agendas like that. I mean, if a committee chair or if a chair of the committee thinks that it belongs in their committee, I think they have the right to put that on their agenda.
Well, There's nothing in the bylaws one way or the other, but the way our board has always operated is that the board chair has a lot of authority. And historically, the board chairs have looked at the agendas, and if they thought something was not appropriate to be taken up in that committee, they would suggest that way it's more appropriate to be taken up in another committee, and your committee can be on that item. In other words, a joint item, but in a different committee. And that's what the board chair is supposed to do. And when I was board chair, I always looked at those agendas, and I assume that most of the board chairs do that.
Okay, but what I'm saying is, I know that this committee, and I'm going a little bit beyond the discussion as step forth in this particular agenda.
Maybe that's another meeting.
Yeah, well, no, but that's what I'm essentially saying. I think that since this committee is called the bylaws and rules,
right.
I mean, I just don't think that, the chair, again, it may be historically a historic power, but I think that if it's the chair in consultation with the chairs, but ultimately, and I think we've come across this at other meetings, if it's, let's say, a landmarks meeting, and even the landmarks portion that's conducted in the main meeting, that portion of the meeting is conducted by the chairs of that committee. They decide who to call on. They, they run that piece of the meeting. And so I don't think, quite frankly, I don't think it's within the sole jurisdiction of the chair of the board to determine the agenda. So I will just put that as an issue to be discussed. But I think as a practical matter, it should always be in consultation with the chairs of those committees.
Okay, thanks. I think it is
before
be discussed.
Respond here just to a couple things.
Yeah, Russell, why don't you go ahead? Yeah.
So just, I don't think I had said in my remarks anything about one way of doing this being appropriate or not appropriate. I didn't really get into that. I don't frankly have a particular view coming into this about how this should be resolved. It's just something that's come up, and I think, I wanted to have a discussion about it. I will say that just what I did describe, I think, is a just purely factual matter, and this is true. All zoning applications or all applications for changes to zoning go to the land use committee. That's currently how it's set up. So whether it's something that's like this sort of weird thing that's in the zoning resolution about how every single physical culture establishment has to get an approval or whatever, that goes to the land use committee. And then all the way up to ULURP. I mean, that's just always how it is. And then some of those issues then also get heard in the zoning and development committee. So what I described in terms of the land use committee hearing those zoning changes is just a sort of factual description, really, of how it operates and how I guess it's operated for a long time. And then I guess the last point is I would echo what Chuck said, that it's been the case for I think as long as anyone can remember, and certainly was in the last 3 years and before that that the chair does sign off on the agendas, and I think that process does involve consultation with the committee chairs, but that's just how it's always been. So.
Right. Good. Thank you, Russell.
Before we continue, I was wondering if we could just turn it to Will for a second. If you could maybe elaborate on kind of what happened with the mansion, maybe, and also what the descriptions of the committees are, how they came to be on the website. I think that might be helpful before we keep going.
Sure. Yeah. The mansion. So, I know there was a lot of discussion about the really high profile, bigger, developments that people talked about. But, the mansion was another example of a ULURP application that was before the board, that we had it scheduled for either a combined land use and full board meeting or a individual land use meeting. I think it was an individual land use meeting where, we require all of our applicants to go out and flyer, and they have to post notice all through the community. I believe the mansion, because some of the board members who I know are on this call were very concerned about it, we actually asked them to post notice, with well further than our normal scope that we asked people to post notice. And right before the meeting, there was a request, and it was accepted that it be moved from the land use committee or the full board meeting to the zoning and development committee. And at that meeting, I know there was some concerns that were raised up to the Manhattan Borough President about the way that the folks in the community were called on and how that meeting was handled, to the point that Gail Brewer came to the next meeting and sat through the entire meeting to observe, out of concern of the way that the previous meeting had been handled. So it was ultimately decided by the land use committee. It was actually the last meeting we had in person, if you all remember that. Seemed like a lifetime ago. And so I think does that help you? I'm not sure that. And we ultimately approved the application. Is that, sorry, I don't know what you were exactly looking for.
I think that's helpful.
Yeah.
Why don't we go ahead and we'll get some more comments and we'll have time to discuss. Rita Popper is next. Can we unmute Rita?
I'm going to be very succinct.
That would be a shock, not for you, just for the board in general.
The committee, the Zoning and Development Committee are the experts, just as you are the expert in transportation. And we who are members of committee come in, join, and learn. And hopefully we learn. There is so much going on in zoning and development. It takes a tremendous amount of insight and of work and of understanding all of the nuances that go into whether something is appropriate or not appropriate. I honestly could not, I couldn't see this any other way than having zoning and the experts in zoning then go to the land use full board meeting and tell them what transpired in an even more succinct way than I'm doing right now. But that is just a pattern. It just follows. I don't even know why we're doing this, but I'm here to learn. Thank you.
Thank you, Rita. Okay, Barbara Rutter next. Barbara, can we unmute Barbara?
Hi. First of all, Chuck, I agree with most of what almost everything that you had to say, and I appreciate it. I'd like to give a little history. It's sort of what you said, but I'm going to give it in more detail. When I got on the board, it was after you were chair and Barry, it was when David Liston was chair. And Terry Slater, may she rest in peace, was co-chair of the zoning committee. And I remember I was confused. What's the difference between land use and zoning? I always want to learn what's going on. And I was told something, and it worked up until 3 years ago. The zoning committee dealt with two things. One was signage. And at that period, we heard month after month after month about the movie theater west of Lexington Avenue that had closed and the marquee was still there and so on. So that was the signage, but it was also big issues. So as an example, there was something about, will zoning change about the, something about the backyards if there was a certain type of stuff. Certainly the 220 foot is something that was a zoning issue. They were doing something on pops along the way, big issues. Never up until 3 years ago did they hear that I remember, and was it appropriate to hear specific one building after another. And it changed. And I think it's broken because I try to go through and I find it very frustrating. I try to listen and try to learn. I'm not an expert on it, but we hear the things in zoning and often 1 month after another. And then it comes to land use. And let's talk about the last thing that we talked about. That was the mayor's proposal. It was all of a sudden somebody said, don't listen to anything you heard at the zoning committee. It was all wrong. And there's a resolution in the zoning committee, a resolution, and it's just it just isn't right. I think that the full board, and if we do want to make it it should be the chair that I think is then chair of that committee, you know, if you want to make it a separate committee, because it is the chair that has the ear of the borough president, that could work with the borough president, that has other information that can go along. And that's that's my feeling about the zoning committee, that I think that there's just been duplication along the way. As far as jurisdiction, I could not disagree with Peter Patchmore. There have been so many cases that I can personally talk about when there's questions about which committee it should go to. And I could tell you a couple of different issues. One included with you, Chuck, when I was co-chair of the Parks Committee. You know, there was an issue about the 81st Street footbridge, whether it's transportation or parks, but others along the way. As chair of the Health Committee, certainly a couple of years ago, Alita would remember that there should be a jurisdiction. The way we handled it before, I remember at an executive meeting that was a meeting of the whole, if it came from a certain department, that is the committee that had it, and then it was joint with another one. There was an issue between parks and landmarks and so on that went through with that. And when you start, Peter, I promise I will never have an education meeting on the health or environment. It is the chair that should be the experts. I could give you an example, because I am now the new co-chair of the Environment Committee. Kaz and I went walking today with the sanitation department through the C-Rights office to find out more about garbage and what's going on there so that we could learn a lot more. And this is the way it should be. When it's big issues, the way it always worked before, and it even worked with Lenox Hill, is we had task force. Alita made the comment that is it transportation, is it parks? She didn't mention health, but she could, education. I always think of it as a horizontal or vertical. What task force does is it brings in, rather than having a separate meeting in transportation, separate meeting at parks, it would bring in all of these various experts at one. And I think we missed an opportunity with the blood center. To say that the blood center won't come to a task force, well, they're not giving in to anything with the zoning committee anyway. And I found that amazingly shocking that they didn't give in 1 foot and presented exactly the same thing, in fact, worse. So those are my different issues. I've been on for a while, not as long as you, Chuck, but longer than some of the other people. And I remember how it worked, and it did, and it wasn't broken then. And the duplication is just wrong. And I do believe the chair. I am going to say one other thing, that the disrespect towards the chair this time, when we hear we're putting it on the agenda, whether you like it or not, is just something that is hurtful for me as somebody that loves and respects the community board. And I do hope that we have respect for the chair and along the way. And we have in the past, and I wish it would continue at this point.
Thank you, Barbara. Okay. I see Sherry Weiner next, if we could unmute Sherry.
Hi, full disclosure, I am a member of the Zoning and Development Committee. The way our community board is set up, we have specialized committees, and people on those committees have an interest and in many cases an expertise how to deal with the subject matter that they're dealing with. When I went back and looked at the definitions that are given to the two committees, the Land Use Committee reviews all applications. It doesn't say the Land Use Committee does any analysis. They review it. And then when you go to the Zoning and Development Committee, it talks about regulation, height, bulk, size, configuration. It also proposes changes to the zoning regulation. The way I see the two committees, they complement each other. The people on the Zoning and Development Committee get into the nitty gritty, the nuts and bolts of every application. That can't be done at the Land Use Committee. The Land Use Committee is the entire board. Many people have an interest in development, but that's not, they didn't, if they did, they'd be on the Zoning Committee. So what I'm saying is that, and I've always advocated that everything should go to a specific committee before it's brought to the board. So if we're looking at the land use committee as the committee of the whole, it should have the expertise of the zoning and development committee. The kind of questions that are posed by our committee members. I mean, we have people on there who the architects and who the planners who know the kind of questions that we should get the information on, and then we present it to the land use committee when apropos. So I think that I don't see that there's a conflict between the two, and I think it's very important for those who've been attending the meetings on the hospital and on the blood center to see the kind of information that the zoning committee has been able to gather. And then we share that information with the rest of the board. So I certainly encourage that we keep both committees, keep the zoning and development committee, but you have to have a zoning committee with people who have the expertise and knowledge to go after the developers and ask the questions that need to be asked. Thank you,
Sherry. And I just want to remind folks that, as we said in the beginning of the meeting, the purpose of this discussion was never about whether either of those committees should exist. That's also not in our purview, frankly. So really, again, it's about the scope and jurisdiction, and no one here is suggesting that the Zoning and Development Committee should cease to exist. So if we could unmute Anthony to go next.
Hi. I didn't think this was so complicated. I, in fact, thought that this is a pretty simple thing, that issues related to zoning and development are brought up in the committee and then are brought to the board. And yes, the ULURP applications automatically go to the full board. But I think we all know the reasons why there is a zoning and development committee. It is the first look at projects before they're subject to the up and down vote by the entire board during the ULURP period, which is only 60 days. It is the opportunity for us as a board, or those of us on the board who are interested in the subject, to hone our arguments for or against a particular project or proposal. It gives us a chance to think about it for a while in advance. It is also the opportunity, and I admit rarely, for the community board to actually shape a proposal before it reaches the ULURP stage. Witness some of the very minor changes that have happened to projects over the last few years, certainly during while I've been on the board. In fact, last week, contrary to what Barbara noted, the attorneys for Paul Selver suggested that it might be possible to modify the zoning change that he was asking for, not for the Blood Center site, but certainly for the block fronts on 2nd Avenue, which are also part of our district. And it also is the only extended opportunity for the public to comment at length on proposals. We had, sadly for all of us, a 4-hour meeting last week, attended by 300 people. And it was an opportunity for the public to tell us what they thought. And you know what? The neighbors actually do know best. And it also, that public involvement at the committee level, gives all of us on the committee members, a chance to shape our views relative to the needs and the desires of the community, which is what we're here for anyway. I think it's I have to admit on a sort of personal note that this particular committee, the Rules and Bylaws Committee, I'm glad we're meeting, you're meeting, and but that the last meeting was in fact almost exactly 8 years ago. And the topic at that time was the relationship of the Zoning and Development Committee to the Land Use Committee. And in the minutes of that meeting, it is suggested that perhaps the Land Use Committee had become superfluous. I don't think that's true, but it wasn't about any feelings about zoning and development. It was in fact more that the compulsory attendance at a second meeting might not in fact be necessary. Anyway, that's what the minute said. I wasn't there. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. Marco Tamayo, we can unmute him.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me start saying something very important. Let me start saying this is the community board, the community board. So we have to pay strong attention to the community, to the residents. And the residents, always they has been asked me, one common complaint that I have from the resident was why Euler has one shot deal at the land use while the other committees has been having two opportunities at the committee level and at the full board for the public input. So I remember very well when I moved to the Upper East Side, was early 90s, not far away from the history that Chuck presented to us. I remember that I can easily, I never have a problems on the traffic on York Avenue. York Avenue was a pleasure for many cars, especially the taxis. They used to use York Avenue, but now York Avenue sometimes it reach 82nd and 83rd Street. The traffic. That is the consequence of Euler. That is what I'm standing for. Euler has been having serious problems. One opportunity for the public to comment, and that's it. Let me remind you that zoning and land use are one unit. Zoning district establishes the regulations governing their land use and development. These dual actions must be together and cannot be removed from each other. Remember, those that create these regulations was a realtor experts. The zoning includes from yard, rear yard, use, etc., which are known as the right to development. When there is a discretionary action, Euler, this means to breach the protection established. It should be have even more overview on this discretionary action. And this community has to be one complement to each other, like they're doing right now. However, I had to mention that we had to be very vigilant to use Robert Rules procedure to be fair to the applicant and to be fair to the community, because that is the role of the co-chair or is better called the facilitators. And that has to be applied to all of them, and in order to have a reasonable discussion. But the point is, as a planner, as an architect, I see clearly that somebody in an arbitrary way, they divided this part. Well, the past is past. Now we have to live the future. And the future, we have to see the past. And the past are telling us that our decisions of York Avenue transportation is a nightmare. They want to create some solutions for this traffic. There is no solution. Nobody's gonna have something magic to resolve that problem. Why? Because too many jobs concentrated in one specific space. Thanks to the good benefits of the air rights that create excessive amount of jobs. Jobs bring good for the city. That's right. I'm not against jobs. What I'm against is jobs should be spread around the city. And that is the arguments, by the way, of the residents. Every time that I has been in the community board, I'm seeing excellent residents that it has been complaining. And today we have one of the best, Maribel. He is very impressed in the way that he covered many issues. So the community has to be part of this discussion always. And we never have to separate the zoning and ULR. In reality, it's one unit, as I said before, as the definition of zoning, because one cannot be separated from each other. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marco. If we could unmute Michelle Birnbaum, please.
Hi, thank you all very much. I just want to say I've been on the board since 2006, so I remember very well the little skirmishes between committees of jurisdiction, quite minor, quite solvable, not a big deal. Considering it's all these years, almost 15 years, I can count on one hand the number of times that those problems have arisen. They were manageable. There was no issue. I am a perfectly happy camper with the way things are with these two committees. And I remember very well that zoning and development also covers signage. I work very hard on that issue. On banners that are hanging on landmark churches, on the movie theater, all kinds of things, on the pops. That's fine. So zoning and development there are many things that committee works on, but it is invaluable to the community when large projects happen, when complicated projects happen, and it is the only way an actual committee and not a committee of the whole can actually follow these projects in multiple meetings where there's some continuity from the first meeting to the second to the third, where the same community members who have this issue of concern, they come to these meetings and they follow the situation. That you cannot possibly have the same amount, a discussion with the same amount of depth and clarity and public input in a meeting of the board as a whole. There are 50 board members. We can have 300 community members show up. You want to give everybody an opportunity to talk. It is an unrealistic way to happen. If we wanted meetings less than 4, 5, 6 hours, that's not the way to achieve it. I have no problem with the way things are handled now. I'm fine with the land use committee. We know what goes to that. It can be used at the discretion of the chair. If the board meeting, the full board meeting will be too full that month, as often has happened, we put the chair or somebody put the street life committee in the land use meeting, so that, because that usually has many items. And so if it looked like the board meeting was going to be long, you can put it at land use. Land use didn't have to meet every month, and it doesn't. It meets when necessary, or if the full board agenda is too full and can't handle a land use presentation. But and also think about what's happening now with the new plan, the new city plan that we've been hearing about. That is going to be very big, very complicated. Our chair has now formed a subcommittee to handle that or to look at it. Of course, everybody's welcome to that subcommittee, but very often these kinds of discussions have to be handled in a smaller realm. It doesn't exclude anybody because everybody is welcome. But when you get into complicated issues, it's much more effective and efficient to discuss them in a way if the community shows up, they will have an opportunity to speak, because the committee is not overwhelmed with so many board members that nobody else has any time to speak. I agree with Ed. I think this is a solution in search of a problem. Any little issues that come up along the way can be easily solved. And very often, very often we don't need more rules. Sometimes more rules cause more disturbance. This is working fine at the way it's written now, at the discretion of the co-chairs of a committee, at the discretion of the chair of the board. We're working together. We're doing fine. I see no reason to complicate it. And we're very productive. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. If we could unmute Ed Hartsock, please. I'm not sure if he's there though.
I'm here.
Okay, hi.
I'm here. And I will be very, very brief. So I had, first of all, I would just like to echo everything Peter and Valerie and Sherry and Michelle and our very early public speakers had to say, much more eloquently than I can. So to the point, and I don't expect an answer to these. These are simply rhetorical questions. First one, why? Why are we here? Second one, what is this it that has come up? I'm not quite sure what the it is that has come up. To echo Michelle and everybody else, Valerie, it's not broke. It doesn't seem broken. So I don't know why we're here, but I would like to bring up something though. And if I could channel my Dwight Waldo for you org theory mavens out there. There's something we used to do when Alita was chair. She had it, the executive committee meeting. And I thought that was a very good meeting because I was looking at the bylaws and I noticed that the chair has to reappoint the chairs of the committees every year. And it's, I guess, it's just a perfunctory kind of thing and that kind of thing. But we haven't had an executive committee meeting, which I thought was very useful because we had an opportunity to sit down with all the new members and the chairs would get together and, we'd be together and we'd talk about each committee and we'd introduce ourselves and the new members. And I thought it was a great opportunity to just have a general discussion about the board and how it functions and what we do. But, all this talk of jurisdiction, and since everybody seems to be very happy with the way things are, and I couldn't concur more, if there was more than 100%, put me down. But I would think, let's have an executive committee meeting. And let's have one of those where each of us, a lot of us here are chairs of a committee. We get together. I know the housing committee, we need to do that. And Greg Morris just got appointed. And Barbara and I, we haven't had a chance to sit down. We've all been very busy. What a great opportunity, right? We all sit down. We write out the jurisdiction. I echo Michelle. I think she's absolutely right. We have a great discussion. I know they do this in every Congress. They all sit down. I know John Dingell, of course, the complaint was that he took everything, but we won't have that here. But, we can have a discussion about the jurisdiction and the way things function and what's been changing. And I think that way everybody kind of understands and maybe we can work through some of these issues. But one other thing, though, just aside from the executive committee suggestion, what does seem to trouble me a little bit, though, and I'll even go back to our previous chair, Nick Viest. I do appreciate the need to go home before midnight. And I know that I am probably of the people in this meeting, according to my mother many, many years ago, as guilty, if not the most guilty person of being loquacious. I get it. I try. I do. I swear to God, I try. But the point is, it is a messy thing. And this obsession with speed worries me a great deal, except if you've driven with me. But that's a different thing. But with all seriousness, this thing with speed does worry me. And you've heard me talk about that. And just as a quick deviation to Barbara's point, kudos to Russell. He called me about this. We had a very nice call, by the way, Russell and I. We agreed that the questioning of members, we're not going to bring that up here, but he and I had a nice discussion. So Barbara, I don't know what you're talking about, this disrespect kind of thing. I do echo it in general. I didn't sense it, but anyway, my point is, this obsession with speed, though, going back to Nick Viest, handing out awards to the public person, Will remembers he was working for Councilman Garodnick at the time. Everybody was trying to win the Viest Award for spitting it out as quickly as you could. And I can appreciate that, as not everybody understands what the purpose of coming to the board meeting is in terms of separating certain functions, and we'll leave it at that. But nevertheless, I am concerned about speed because with all that's going on and something that affects our community district, especially this congestion pricing thing. I don't know if any of you people have been noticing what's going on the 59th Street Bridge, but those things are going in. And I haven't heard one peep about that. Not one iota. Okay, that's a little troubling to me. And I'd like to have a little more discussion about that. So anyway, to wrap up, I think everything is great. echo what everybody else has said. I would love to have an executive committee meeting. I'm worried about the speed issue. I think we should be having more discussion, not less. And that's it. And I am here, even though I put the thing over. I am here. You'll see me. I'll do my little things. But thanks, I am here. You'll see me from time to time.
Great. Thank you so much. And obviously, I'll defer to Russell on the executive committee if you want to address that.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I think we're soon going to have new members appointed, or we're getting that time of year. And so what I think would make sense is once we have a bunch of new members who are appointed newly this year, then I think the suggestion of having them get a chance to sit down and hear about the different committees, particularly now that we're all remote, I think that's a very good idea. So I think I will plan to do that once we get our new members appointed.
Thank you so much.
I want to respond to Ed on something. Ed, it's not a question of speed. That's, in fact, it's the way I view it is it's just the opposite. We have a lot of time wasted on things like what Nick was trying to do was have the elected officials' representatives not take up so much time. So we'd have more time for the committees to actually discuss the issues that come before them. And one of my major complaints about our meetings is that we do get a lot of wasted time. We obviously have to do the public session, but we get a lot of wasted time and we don't have enough time to discuss the committee reports and the actual meat of things. So I think that's the thing that we have to focus on, in my view. But I don't want to get into an argument.
That is a different way of looking at it. Chuck, you and I look at it an entirely different way. I want to hear from them. I want the meetings to be long. Listen, we sign up for this, gang. It's
Listen, wait a minute, Ed. You don't have to tell me. I've been on the board for years and I never miss a meeting. So don't tell me that. But I don't need to listen. I don't need to listen to these people who don't ever tell me anything I don't know. And they have their reports that they put out. They can do it. If the member wants to come and talk, let them come. But if the staff is there, they ought to be held to a short time. And we're doing that on Zoom. And I think it helps a lot.
Can I finish my point, Chuck, or are you done yet?
No, I'm finished. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Can I finish my point? Yeah, back to my point, which is back at you, my friend, which is you signed up for this and you volunteered. And if you didn't like it, last time I checked, Gail Brewer doesn't come to your house and Scott Stringer didn't come to my house and the borough president before Scott and the one before that, and the one before that. They don't come to your house, they don't twist your arm, and they don't break your hands and make you sign up for this. You know going in what it is. And I agree in terms of people's time. And that, wasting of people's time, that can be addressed in the way that you run meetings. But as Peter said, and I echo with everybody else who has gone here before, democracy is a messy, messy little thing. And it does take time. Okay. And so, yeah, everybody hasn't been on the board as long as you, Chuck. We're all not quite as an expert as you are, unfortunately, but we're trying to learn. We're doing our best. I'm doing my best. I'm trying. I'm sorry to, not be as fast, but we are trying. And I would just, offer that up for the public in general, that there's at least one member of the board who believes that. Now, I may not be a member of the board come July for that opinion, but nevertheless, it's an opinion. So
thank you, Ed.
Let me just, can I sorry, just briefly here on the question of the, yeah. So just on the, look, on the timing of the meetings and the speed of the meetings and all of that, I think, hopefully people recognize, obviously it's an art, not a science. And, one of the things that a lot of people had expressed was concern that meetings are running very long. But obviously, there does have to be an opportunity for people to be heard. So all of that, there's a whole balancing that goes into all of that. And I certainly welcome feedback. I don't think we need to get into it more in this meeting, but anybody who has comments or wants to talk to me about length of meetings or whether it can go faster or whether it can go slower or whatever, I welcome that, because again, it's a bit of an art rather than a science. So that's what I have to say about that.
Thank you, Russell. So
sorry, Ty. And just about kind of learning, I think that's also part of why this meeting is being held, is when new members come to the board, they can often be confused about the difference between zoning and development and land use. So by having this conversation and trying to come to a consensus one way or the other, even if it's keeping it exactly the same, is just further clarification, which I think would ease the understanding when new board members come.
As a new board member, I can agree with that. If we can unmute Elaine Walsh, and then I just want to let you know in advance I see a few board members who have already spoken once. We will come back to you, folks like Alita, Valerie, will come back to you, but I'm going to go through the list first for any board member that hasn't spoken. So Elaine Walsh.
Thank you. A couple of questions or points I want to make to clear things up or raise question on, and then talk about zoning and development and land use. In the history given by, I guess, Chuck and Barry or Chuck, it was said that in the early days, and I've been on the board over 25 years, of about 1983 or so, Edith Fisher chaired zoning and development. I remember there was always a zoning and development. So I don't know how you then say Barry created the zoning and development committee. So I think that sometimes we need to look at what is being presented. Another piece before I get to it is the mansion was not a ULUP. It was a zoning text amendment. It went to the committee. It went to land use. It followed procedure. I heard nothing that Gail was upset at how it was handled in the zoning committee. The other thing is, if we're talking about an executive committee is the offices of the board and the co-chairs of the committees. It is not a meeting of the full board. I think what, Russell, you're talking about is almost what has always been done, a welcoming piece to the new board members so we could all meet each other, except with Zoom, that has not been possible. As far as I see, I don't know why it's called land use. From the history, I do know that now. Valerie called it a supplemental full board meeting. I thought of it as an overflow full board meeting. And that meant that because the full board could not, in a shorter period of time, without going late into the night, would not hear zoning issues. And then street life came on. And according to the description in the website, many committees could be heard in what I call the overflow, or I like the word supplemental, because I think it is confusing to call it land use. Any zoning project, individual study analysis has always, during my time, come before zoning, and then it goes to the second full board meeting. The reason we had not seen a lot of major projects in zoning was because there wasn't much going on. All of a sudden, it has popped in our community like it's going out of style. As a past co-chair, and I was co-chair with Terry Slater, and we worked on issues together and understood what had to be done. But in the attempt to get the major projects, of which there are more coming online, to have the public listen and hear and raise questions, we did invite the major two projects, Northwell and the Longfellow Commercial Tower. The issue with both was a refusal to come. We have it documented. The task force for Northwell was set up by the borough president and city council member Keith Powers. That was not a community board task force. And the attempt was to see change. And yes, the residential tower is gone, but we also figured out what that is because you had to put affordable housing in there. And that was going to be a difficult sell, okay? There's been no other changes in that project. None, after a year of task force meetings. Longfellow, we finally got a discussion, I think it was last week or whenever it was. We don't have any commitment. What we had found out and the community found out, which is why zoning is so important, was that in the scoping that was done by Longfellow, they excluded the commercial labs, the LSB 3s, which are environmentally dangerous. So that knowledge has come to the community and they're raising questions, as is now the zoning committee. The supplemental, I like that word very much, supplemental second board meeting is unusual. There is no other community board in Manhattan that has this. Gail Brewer has been very strong in saying we must have a zoning committee or any committees that discuss the issues and have participation by the public prior to it going to a full board meeting. So I don't know. Well, I must say there's been a lot of contention since I've been on the board about zoning because some people don't like us discussing things with developers. That maybe we're stepping on the toes of some people who don't like it. Well, that is our job. And you know, it's interesting, signage we worked on for years and years. And it was a problem because there was a moratorium, there were a lot of issues. But people were happy when we did signage. Oh, what is signage? Doesn't matter. Now that we have a fantastic zoning committee, so knowledgeable, can have so much input, and that the community is so connected now to zoning and the impact that it is having on our community. Let me just say, walk the neighborhood. First Avenue, 79th and 80th, full block up for zoning, for redevelopment. Can you imagine the site there? First Avenue, 86th, 85th, same thing. 76th, 75th, wait, no, 75th, 74th, 3rd, another big one coming up. We have a 800-foot, no, 700, Alito, you know it better than me, 83rd and 3rd. These are all major developments. Some will be as of right because we have yet to move on the 210. That's a question I'd like to know why we're not moving on it. But what are we going to become if we don't, as a committee and as a community and working with the public, we don't have these discussions and try to find solutions? All other communities have a zoning, some of them call it zoning housing development, okay? They will sit with their developers and have for years. Where are we? That's what I want to say. I am very concerned that the issue has come up again because some board members don't like zoning committees and what they focus on. It is so important to our community. We have the largest turnout, I'm sorry, I'm emeritus co-chair, as Ben Keelos tells me, the largest number of community members showing up at our meetings for the last 2 years. Even in person, we were a couple of hundred. So it does mean something to the people. And I hope that we examine this and understand the roles, and that the second full board meeting really is a supplemental meeting to pick up on, as it says on the website, issues that I think can't be dealt with in the hearing. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. If we could, Alita, sorry, I'm going to skip over you since you spoke once. We'll come back to you. Thank you so much for understanding. Elizabeth Ashby, if we can unmute her, please.
Elizabeth.
Super. Yes, I think that there are several absolutely essential functions to having a zoning committee history before you, on the big issues, before you go to the full board in whatever capacity. One of the things is we often alert the public to the fact that somebody's going to build a 700-foot tower in front of their noses. They're unaware of it, and then they become involved. Also, I think the fact that we have to have on the big issues several meetings going along to check on what we're told or not told. I don't want to defame any developers, but a great many of them don't meet with the public, don't provide any information. And so the public, unless we drag them in, the public has no idea. When I don't want to defame them either, but I have known them to mislead the people. I have known them to forget to tell things like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mention that I tore down the back of my building. Great many things come up and have to be investigated during the process. So I think that getting the public involved early, because they know things that we don't know. They live there and see it. And also they're affected and can be involved earlier and longer. And the other function that I think is important that's provided by a zoning committee is to observe problems in the community, like First, Second, Third, and York Avenues have no height limits. And there where we're getting the towers that everybody's complaining about. And the Zoning and Development Committee initiated the proposal that is slowly winding its way through the process to create height limits on the only streets that don't have them in the Upper East Side. And the other problem is all those affordable housing and tenements are going down, so protect those. And we're losing the neighborhood stores and protect those. So we have a function, I think, to initiate what is needed and to involve the public early and often, and to chase up the development committee that really does not want to share any more than it has to, and point out when they're misleading people.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Valerie, we'll come back to you since you already spoke once. I hope that's okay with you. Elizabeth Rose, you're up.
Okay, I think I have unmuted myself successfully.
Yes, you're good.
Good. So I would like to go back to something Russell said at the very beginning of the meeting in an attempt to sort of get at this question of, I think Ed Herzog asked what is the it? And I think what I heard Russell say was, in no other committee does an application get heard by a different committee before it is voted upon by the committee with jurisdiction. That is one way of framing the question. The converse way of framing the question is, in what other topic is an application considered by the full board before it is considered by a committee with expertise and a resolution put before the full board for a vote. So since this is a rules and bylaws committee meeting and not a let's take a side on zoning versus land use committee meeting, I would propose that consistency in our rules and bylaws would suggest that no item come to a vote by the full board before it has been considered by the appropriate smaller committee. I would further say that consistency and process of there is always a committee that reviews and votes upon an issue and makes a recommendation in the form of a resolution to the full board is more consistent for the public and better serves the public by creating a focal point for discussion from the public in advance of a full board vote. And many people have referenced how difficult it is to have and give the time and attention to important issues at a full board meeting. So I think the anomaly here is that the application is not heard by a subcommittee, rather than the anomaly being that a committee hears something before the committee with final jurisdiction.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. Barry Schneider.
Yes, good evening. A couple of points. Elaine Walsh mentioned that the Zoning and Development Committee existed long before I talked about it with Carolyn Greenberg. Not so. The facts are that Connie Adamak established the Land Use Committee and the Zoning Committee was dropped. That's when I talked to Carolyn Greenberg, the former chair, she suggested that we reinstate the Zoning Development Committee, and would I appoint a chair? Absolutely, and that's what happened. A couple of other items. Excuse me. My problem with taking zoning applications to the zoning committee before they're heard by the land use committee is that the problem I've seen in the last several months is that the chairs of the committee are not neutral but advocates, and therefore the discussion has been skewed rather than hearing from the applicant, not the application, but having present what he's thinking of doing in the community, and then examining that. But the last two issues on the New York Blood Center and the Northwell has been skewed from the very beginning of the committee meeting hearings, that we're opposed to these and here's why we're opposed. And then they took votes opposing the project, which had not been presented. So I'll leave that where it is. My other concern is we've abandoned the use of task force. I'm glad to see Russell now calling a special committee, which is wonderful. They worked on the New York, excuse me, on the New York Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They worked on the Park Avenue Armory, and they worked especially well on the Zuckerberg building on East 68, 69th Street. We had 15 hours of discussion, the 15 meetings rather, some 35 hours involving the public, the advocates, the opposers, and at the end of the day, we came up with a very substantial recommendation that the borough president took, made one change, and the application sailed through. So those are my comments. Thank you very much, Chuck and Taina, to having this meeting. I think it's very important we have this discussion.
Thank you so much, Barry. And next, Trisha.
Hey, everybody. So first of all, I really wanted to thank the co-chairs. I feel like I've been talking about getting a bylaws meeting on the books for years. So I think that this is great. And I hope that you guys have more meetings, because I do think that some of the things that were raised about the role of the chair, the just jurisdictional things. I think that this probably spans more than one meeting, and I hope that you do continue to have these conversations. I know I look forward to being part of them. I took a long time to raise my hand because I was trying to listen in to hear what everybody had to say, and I appreciate everybody's comments. I think that at the end of the day, I think from what I'm hearing, it's a question of potentially streamlining a process versus the benefits of what we have in place. I think at the end of the day, the role of a community board, an essential part of it being on the community board, is to provide resources and information and education to the public. I think that we serve an essential link between our elected officials and somebody who just lives in our community, somebody who's never really thought to pick up the phone, except that they just want to see their park clean, or they just have a problem with a parking sign in front of their building. And we serve a really critical kind of link there in terms of education. And after listening to everything tonight, I do think that that the zoning committee certainly does provide a critical link of education for our community. I think that we need to kind of preserve that as much as we can. The meetings have been massive, and for a lot of folks, it is their opportunity to dive down deeper. I agree. I think that ULURP applications should be heard by the committee of the whole. I think it's important. I think that it's important that land use and those big decisions are arguably the most important fights that we have in our district. And it takes a lot for me to say, because I will also argue that parks are the most important part in our district. But I think that really and truly it's good to have the committee of the whole. But on that same note, I do understand that community met residents have a lot of questions, and they really want to dive down deep into this. It's obvious. So to have that service, to have the ability for, as Elizabeth Ashby said, to engage them often and often and in depth makes a lot of sense. So I'm wondering if the answer to this is not looking at, frankly, I looked at the missions of both the land use committee, the land use description, and the zoning. And my critique would be that maybe both should be more specific, or both missions should be maybe cleared up, which again, maybe not, it doesn't happen tonight, but it does happen between now and the next meeting, so that we could get some proposal of clarity that way. But at this point, I would certainly not recommend taking away and I know, Taina, to your point, that wasn't on the table, but just to add my voice to this, I think that keeping in mind that community boards provide essential resources and education to the broader public, that zoning committee does do that service.
Thank you, Trisha.
Thanks. And we're definitely going to be meeting more frequently and hopefully updating our bylaws.
Yes. Craig?
So stay tuned.
Some people have suggested maybe they don't need us, which is okay. But go ahead, Tanya.
Craig.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to try to be brief. So let me just start by acknowledging I have a different take on this whole discussion. I don't know how popular it's going to be, but please hear me out. So first, I heard a few times tonight the question, why are we here? In my mind, a perfect example occurred just this month when an overtly biased presentation from an advocate from outside our community presented his take on the Planning Together City Council proposal at the Zoning and Development Committee just 1 week before the Land Use Committee was able to receive an initial fact-based presentation from public officials, where as a full board, we had been given, we were now given that presentation that we frankly should have received first before any advocates had a chance to sort of muddy the waters. This to me exemplifies the overlap that exists between land use and zoning and development committees and why we're here tonight. As a planner, one of the basic things that I've learned are things that are inextricably linked. Zoning and land use is just one perfect example of that. And in my mind, development takes on an entirely different connotation, especially when discussing a committee that has in recent years seen a majority of its discussions revolve around development concerns that are being framed as either preserving existing zoning or proposing larger scale zoning changes. So what should the jurisdiction of the Zoning and Development Committee be as it relates to the Land Use Committee? And how engaged should the full board be on any matter that will ultimately come up as a ULURP item? My belief is we should consider shifting the jurisdiction and nomenclature of these committees so that we have a standing Land Use and Zoning Committee that hears any item that in which variances and ULURP are up for discussion, where in this case, everyone gets to hear everything from start to finish and sees the progression of any debates and discussions as plans evolve and updates are made over time, and people have a chance to see everything holistically. And I think after all, this is the real singular official role that community boards have statutorily. So why should a subset of the board be taking the early lead on such issues and proposals that results in some not participating from the get-go and them having to then have learning curves as they learn about proposals and begin their engagement after many members have already formed opinions and are already being vocal about it. Separately, so in terms of the current Zoning and Development Committee, maybe we should change that to something like a Development and Context Committee, where we could be discussing broader issues, including those that end up resulting in production of rezoning proposals that would ultimately get reported out to a land use and zoning committee, and where things such as signage, aesthetics, building heights, things of that nature can really be discussed, because I think that is a really important thing that probably should have more broader discussion than just as part of the land use discussion. So in terms of then the final point is just, we talk about meeting lengths. I'd rather sit through more meetings in which we discuss any projects of district-wide significance, so where the full board can be fully engaged. I may be as frustrated as others are by long meetings, but hey, this is what we signed up for. This is the commitment that we made, and we should then be prioritizing full engagement on such big ticket items, even if it means potentially longer meetings or even additional meetings if we have to have multiple meetings on a large scale issues such as the blood center or Northwell, things of that nature. If we were to institute such an approach, I think it would be infrequent where we'd have more or longer meetings, but I think that would be entirely worthwhile. So again, I don't know that this is going to be popular, but I just wanted to provide that alternative view. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Craig. Billy?
Good evening, everyone. I view this issue pretty simply, which is maybe a red flag in itself, but I do not see the advantage to having us meeting as a full land use committee on these issues sometimes in the first instance. And I don't want to create a straw man, but I could imagine some folks thinking, and this is maybe what I just heard a little bit from Craig, these issues are incredibly significant. Singular was the word Craig used, that, the entire board should be plugged in at the outset. I see the advantages to doing that. I see why it sounds good in theory, but there are even greater advantages, in my opinion, to having a dedicated group led by experienced chairs assessing district altering proposals regarding land use and specifically ULURP proposals. So I think what I'd like to see us do, this is just one board member's opinion, and it may require clarification in the bylaws, is specifying that land use applications, ULURP applications, go to a zoning, land use, and development committee, which is tasked with questioning those applicants, understanding the implications of those applications, rendering an opinion, passing a resolution on those applications. And then that would go, as always needs to happen, especially in a ULURP, to the full board. And I like the word that Elena was using earlier, supplemental. Our full board meetings are the agendas are too long as it is to then, I think, tack on a larger discussion of ULURP. So there will be months where we have to have a supplemental full board meeting. Essentially what I'm describing is not too different from what we currently do with having a land use meeting occasionally. And we don't have those land use committees so frequently that I think this would at all, be a problem for the board. But I guess what I'm trying to say is I really think, and I've looked at what other community boards do a little bit here, it would be a mistake not to task a more narrow committee, narrow in terms of membership, expertise, dedicated members, focusing on these projects in the outset so that they can help advise the rest of us, given their expertise. That's not stopping any board member under our current bylaws for wanting to attend those zoning meetings to become an expert as well in the first instance. But I don't think it ought to be something that's required of every member necessarily. So to wrap up, I guess what I'd like to see is I think there's a redundancy created. And if you look at the land use committee's description, I think it is a little bit redundant with what we should be tasking zoning with doing. I think we should have a committee that's dedicated zoning, land use, and development that should hear these applications. And then it should go to a full board meeting as typically it would for a vote. The last thing I'll say is I think there's maybe an undercurrent in some of these discussions, and maybe folks don't want to, maybe folks want to tiptoe around it. But it was said earlier that there was some, I guess, frustration with Mr. Graziano speaking and whether he was a biased expert or whether he was adequate or not. If folks on this board feel that, the zoning committee, say, made a mistake in bringing him in and should have had to speak it from the city council, I'm sure there are other board members who would feel vice versa. But maybe that's something that we can address in some other context as a board. If there are people with genuine concerns about the zoning committee, we should have that discussion. I certainly hear it from other board members, but I personally have a lot of confidence, Elizabeth and Anthony and their expertise. And I think we benefit as a full board when we have someone and I'll just single out Anthony for a moment, of his expertise, taking on these issues with his knowledge, being able to inform our board what he's learning, what he's seeing, and that we can kind of follow his lead on a lot of these applications. I think we're the better for it. So that's my contribution to this discussion for what it's worth.
Thank you so much, Billy. And just as a reminder, I am not going in order. I am skipping over folks who have already spoken to give a chance to members who have not spoken. So I'm looking down our list. I believe Rita has not spoken. Rebecca, is that correct? I think.
No, Rita spoke earlier.
Felice
is next. And then Barbara Chalky. Those are the people.
Thanks. I thought this was a really thoughtful and interesting discussion tonight. For the question that Rebecca raised earlier, as a new board member, I have been confused about the role between the land use committee and the zoning committee. So this has been very helpful and just clarifying for me the different perceptions on the two committees. And I guess my perception of the land use, the zoning discussions with some really impactful issues before the committee is it's come across as though an opinion has been made in advance without an opportunity to really hear the issues from the developer and dig into questions. I think it should be about drilling down on the questions about the development and raising the concerns. And we can ultimately vote up or down on the project, but I think we close off discussion and maybe even potential amendments from the developer when it seems clear from the discussion that our views are negative and not open-minded. So what I would really encourage is that the discussion from the zoning committee be more kind of a drill down questioning of proposals rather than kind of what seems to me to be the approach that's kind of negative from the start, and I think that limits discussions. Although certainly, everybody on the committee is very thoughtful and very knowledgeable and really wants to do what's right for the community. I'm concerned about duplication in discussions at different meetings, and I guess one question I have is after the land, so the land use committee is the entire board. After the land use votes, up or down on a ULURP application, does it then go to the board again, or is that so that's considered the board vote? Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Yes.
And then I'm concerned about resolutions kind of up or down on proposal before it's gotten to the ULURP stage. I think it's more appropriate to, and I'm new to this, so but I think it's more appropriate to kind of raise the questions and highlight all the questions and issues and really drill down on answers, and then wait till the ULURP stage to then say, we approve it or we disapprove it, as opposed to kind of raising questions and using it as an opportunity to comment at all the different stages on the project, like when the detailed comments were issued on the scoping session. So those are my thoughts on this.
Thank you so much, Delise. Barbara, Chuck?
And just about ULURP. So I think it was mentioned earlier that some people might think that the public only has one opportunity to speak once ULURP starts, but we have 60 days. So as Will said, theoretically, we could hold 60 meetings. So just want to raise that.
Thank you. Barbara?
Barbara Jackie, you can unmute on your screen.
I'm sorry, what I have to say may not be as relevant because I had trouble with my computer and I thought I put my hand up 2 hours ago, but it didn't go up. So I was chair before Chuck, before Barry. Barry was actually my first vice chair, so we worked closely together. When Chuck was right, the land use committee was created because we were meeting till 1, 2 a.m. in the morning, and we needed more time for discussion of all these new development. The development that was happening then was buildings were being torn down and we were losing all the old law tenements for new buildings. So it was very relevant. At the time, the committee was set, the full board voted on it to create it. And I don't have the language in front of me. Somebody may want to look at it, actually how that language, and maybe it should have been written differently to make it clearer. I do think the zoning committee is crucial. I think the zoning and development committee is one of the best committees that has, because it's long discussions, it's important discussions. And when the committees were set up, it was always the whole board that voted to set up new committees through a rules committee change. It's just in the last year or two, the chairs have been creating a lot of new committees themselves. That can be discussed separately if that's good or bad. There may be too many committees at times, but it was always the full board that voted on the committees and set up the committees. And again, I think I agree, there's no need to change it. We may want to modify the committee, how the zoning committee works. I think it is working. I don't think it needs major changes. And through the agendas, when I was chair, when Barry was chair, and I think when Chuck was chair, the chairs of the board always reviewed the agendas. So that's how some of the problems of committees arguing who has jurisdiction. Maybe people don't want to do that anymore, but I think that was very helpful, that it was the chair of the whole board that decided what committee should do what function. And we did have joint committees, and I came to a lot of board meetings before I was even on the board. So it was always a lot of task forces, but also a lot of joint committee meetings. At this point, that's all I have to say, but I think it's crucial that the Zoning and Development Committee continues. And I agree with whoever said it's a problem that it's a solution that's looking for a problem, or a problem that's looking for a solution. We don't have a problem. I don't think it is. It has been functioning very, very well. That's why, as I said, I was going to say this way before.
Thank you so much, Barbara. So I think at this point we have covered everybody that has spoken once. Is that correct, Rebecca?
Jane,
great.
Jane, unmute.
Frankly, I think this has been a very useful exercise. I don't think we've had a chance to really sort of bare our souls about the way we think about certain aspects of the community board. One thing I do want to say is that we're all experts, that I cannot say that the zoning committee is a group of experts who have more knowledge and are better educated and better equipped than any of the rest of us. We all have opinions, we're entitled to them, we bring different perspectives depending on our own individual backgrounds and the issues we really care about and are concerned about. So I just wanted to set the record straight on that. When I look at an issue, I just look at it from my own particular and peculiar perspective on that issue. The other thing I want to say is, and I always admired David Liston for trying to limit the representatives of the elected officials. They were so repetitive. They were each saying the same thing about every single bill that was before the assembly, before the state legislature, before the city council. So I admired him for trying to limit what the time frame for what these representatives were going to present to us. That said, I've been on the community board perhaps for too long, but it's for years, the land use committee worked perfectly. I don't remember having any issues with it. Now I can see that zoning development perhaps does dig a little bit deeper into these issues. But for the record, they're high profile issues even before we had these huge turnouts at zoning and development on these huge potential applications for variances down at the City Planning Commission or before the BSA. You always got a huge turnout. If the public cares about an issue, they show up. Thank you. And I want to thank the committee for giving all of us an opportunity to speak to things that are near and dear to us.
Thank you so much, Jane. Okay, now I think I've gotten to everyone. We can start from the top. I don't know, Chuck, Rebecca, if you want to weigh in. I think we would ask, though, if you're not making a new point, to please consider lowering your hand. I think we've heard from a lot of folks at this point. This was a really productive discussion. But I think, in the interest of time, and also acknowledging, I get it that we all sign up for this, but if you are going to say something that is not new, please consider lowering your hand.
So I was unmuted. I wasn't sure if you were.
Yeah, go ahead, Russell.
Okay. Well, this isn't entirely new, really. I would say, first of all, I agree. I think this has been a very helpful discussion. I also, it's not the universal view, but it certainly seems to be the consensus that people are basically happy with how things are being done now. So, I mean, it sounds to me like people don't feel that changes are needed. And I guess, maybe that's good news, but in any event, so I guess if that's the case, maybe we just leave it as it is and don't need to make any changes, but I think it's still good to have had the discussion and to have talked it over and, gotten people's views on it.
Sure, agree. So I'm assuming that if you still have your hand up, then you are going to contribute something new and original that has not been said and that you have not said. So, noting that, Alita.
Thank you. I'll be very quick. Thank you, Russell. I'm really glad to hear that. Barbara Rutter, you may recall that I asked you about the health equity issue with Northwell and task forces. Barry, I completely agree with you. If there was a receptiveness from the applicants to meet with us and consider what we were saying and allow us to have input, then by all means, a task force would be a great idea, but that's just not happening with these kinds of projects. And for Jane, I have always thought of you and David David as experts on landmarks. I have learned so much and it's made me even more passionate about landmarks and historic districts. I think the chairs of every committee have much more knowledge than I certainly do. And I know as chair of the board that I did not know about zoning what Elaine and Anthony and Elizabeth know, and I think some other people as well. And I would not have been as effective a chair on ULURP applications without having understood more about zoning and seeing that come. So I would say that that's really important. And then just also, again, from my own point of view, zoning is one piece of ULURP. If it were just a question of, does it comply with zoning? It would be easy, because if it doesn't, then that's it, we vote no. But they're asking for a change in the in zoning, or they're asking for, if it's not ULURP, they're asking for some kind of variance or something major, and they're giving reasons for it, and they're making explanations. And if they wanted to build an airport on East End Avenue where 2 people planes could land, don't you think that Chuck and Craig would be looking at it from the transportation point of view? With the hospital, if they hadn't taken away the condo, shouldn't Jane and David and the Landmarks Committee have looked at its fronting and being a carve out from the Park Avenue Historic District? These are pieces, and like any other piece in any other relevant portion, and I do like whoever suggested it, and I'm sorry, maybe it was Elizabeth Rose, that that we have committees look at everything before it comes to the full board, for the expertise, for the deep dive, for the public, for the public education, as Tricia pointed out. I think that's really valuable. I don't know how original this all was, but I'm really glad to hear that we'll keep things as they are, because these committees are critical. I know there was something else based on what Felice has said. And Felice, I'm happy, and I'm sure the chairs of the zoning, and I don't want to step on Russell's toes, I'm sure Russell would be happy to talk to anyone who wants to talk about ULURP and the zoning committee as well. But I always saw them as the ULURP as being inclusive of the zoning point of view, as well as things that come up through other committees. So thank you for the opportunity to speak again. And I guess I was going to say something to Barry, but I'll just do that privately so as not to embarrass anybody. So thanks again.
Thank you, Alita. And I saw Carolina, who had not spoken yet, had her hand up. So if we could unmute Carolina.
Hi there. So just to touch upon a couple of the points that, and I've been listening to everyone's point of view just across the board. And one thing that I think always happens when we have discussions, whether they're related to zoning, landmarks, or just any other topic when we're having meetings, is that a lot of the times I feel like us as board members get very personal when it comes to decisions that we're deciding upon, and we're not actually taking into consideration sort of the whole aspect of the community. So the example would be like, well, I feel like there shouldn't be a landing strip on East End, but maybe that's not how the rest of the community feels. And I know that when I come to meetings, I try to sort of play devil's advocate, for better or for worse, and stand, because not everyone in the community is going to agree on everything. And like everyone's been saying, sort of, politics are messy. But therefore, I think there should also be some of us folks, and I'll include myself, even if I'm, the chief standing alone, playing devil's advocate every time something comes up, because I want to be the voice for the other people in the community that perhaps don't feel that way. And I feel like somehow, sometimes, there is something that everyone agrees on because it's for the better good of everyone. But sometimes when we are really divided, I feel like there is some bullying going on within sort of our committees and people who've been on the board longer, because they feel entitled, because they've been on the board more years than some of the less seasoned members. And therefore, instead of listening to different points of views, or like I said, sort of the newer blood, and obviously the Upper East Side is skewing younger, it's changing. And I think a lot of the times we don't take that into consideration. So yes, there are certain things that sort of for the greater good we all agree on, but others we don't. And it really does become sort of this like tug and pull within our own board, instead of really holistically looking at something, and sometimes really just giving and saying, you know what, you're right. And I think that's sort of an internal issue. And secondly, and I'm going obviously long here, but when it comes to discussions, sometimes we as members also go over these like 2-minute time frames. And I'm not saying that we should establish a 2-minute time frame, but I think that really we could be succinct. Come prepared, come with your 2 minutes, sort of like we did with the public session. I don't need to hear the same thing 15 times. And if you feel so compelled that you think you are going to change my mind, then reach out to me offline ahead of the meeting, and I'm happy to listen. But I think these meetings do run long because a lot of the time, again, as Tyne has been saying, the same folks over and over sort of regurgitate the same points, and we really never just get down to it.
Well,
Thanks.
if I could just comment, since I don't know if I'm one of those longstanding board members that you were referring to, but I agree with what you said. I've always felt myself that as a community board, we have to look at all the various communities in our district and take advantage of, and take into account rather, the viewpoints of the whole community. And that's a tricky thing to do. So I appreciate what you're saying.
Cause?
Yeah, I mean, we've been going on all night. I think we as a community board are to listen to the community and liaise with the agencies. We're not here to make decisions, and that's been happening quite a bit of the time. Not quite a bit, but sometimes by some of the board members. They offer their point of view, and that's what should be done. On the question of the land use and the board and the zoning, why don't we just form one committee, have them duke it out and report back to the full board? Then we don't have to, there's overlap to a certain extent. So form one committee for zoning and land use, let them argue it out, let them come to a resolution and submit it to the full board. That'd eliminate all this discussion. Thanks.
Great. Michelle?
Thank you. I just want to say thank you to Russell. I think it is the consensus to leave things as they are, and I'm glad that for the moment anyway that you're planning to do that. I just wanted to address some specific comments that were made. First, someone, I believe it was Craig, suggested that we don't get enough information. In other words, if a land use issue or if the zoning issue, if it's a big project and there's a lot of details and it's very big and it just comes to that community, that maybe the rest of the board is not knowledgeable enough because they don't hear the whole presentation, see all of the visuals. Well, I just wanted to say that that's true for every single thing that we discuss. When something comes to the Landmarks Committee, we can spend an hour and a half of visuals and measurements and detailed conversation. When it gets to the full board for the vote, if you guys see a picture, that's a lot, because there's no way to make these full presentations to the whole body. That's why we have committees. One of the biggest things that we've done in this city was a network of bike lanes and city bike. This was all handled in the Transportation Committee. When it came to the full board, all you saw was a resolution, and everybody used their best judgment and either voted it up or voted it down. Nothing that was presented in detail to transportation was ever presented in detail to the full board. Also, with respect to the zoning committee and hearing what some characterize as a biased point of view about the new city planning proposal. I was on that call for 7 hours where this proposal was presented by the City Planning Commission, not by the council, and to the City Planning Commission, and the representative of the City Planning Commission was there, who is opposed vehemently to this proposal as it stands. I listened to 7 hours of advocacy by the Speaker of the City Council. That's advocacy too. because they are the ones who wrote this bill. And so when they present it, they too are advocates. So the fact that the community board has additional points of view presented, I think it's a good thing. The other thing I wanted to say is that you have to realize that with land use issues and anything that has to do with building or construction or anything, the people involved, the developers and all their support group, they have been working on this project, whichever project it is, they're working on it for 5 years prior to it breaking into the newspaper, and that's when we all hear about it. They have all their ducks in a row. It's a business for them, and they should have all their ducks in a row. But when it finally is made public and it finally comes to the community, we're all like hamsters on, a treadmill, trying to play catch up and learn about and discuss all of the things that these professionals, high-level professionals on every single level, have been working on for years and years and years before it comes to us. And then it rests with us to do all the research, try to catch up, and make it known to the community. And the community finds out about it at the same time because it went into the newspaper. And they are generally thankful that one of our committees on any of these subjects is taking it on. And in fact, to my mind, we don't listen to them enough. I know that I have points of view, as everybody else does, as well you should, but I know that I am very sensitive to what the community is saying. And the community is many times in the minority position of what the board thinks. And so they're the ones that feel put out. I try very hard to represent them. So I just throw that out there that the claim that like the advocacy is not fact-based. Well, in the case of the City Planning Commission, that wasn't fact-based either, because they skewed the fact and what was actually in that bill, and the sins of omission in that bill also skewed the facts. So, points of view are points of view. They come from everybody, and we want to hear them all. And we have to remember that that is our role. Thanks.
Marco?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to raise 2 points. The first one is what Barry said. He's complaining about the role of the co-chair. And I had several training in Robert rules by the Board of Presidents. And clearly they said the chairs or co-chairs has to be impartial, has to allow the debate is happening, has to give the opportunity both sides of the issue to be presented. And at the same time, they cannot participate in the debate. This is what they call facilitators. And that is the major point, I think, is the most crucial part in this meeting, because we didn't change nothing, but we have to follow that regulation. I think Chuck, usually he handled very well, at least in the Zoom program. I'm seeing how he handled it. He's very strict because that is his role. He functioned as a facilitator of the meeting. He is, even though he's an expert probably in transportation, but he maintained his role. And I think that is the most important part. The other part that I would like to talk is about somebody said the opinion is made in advance. That I am 100% agree. And this is why I think it is those people that participate in the debate, we have the obligation with our comments to reach those fellow community members that would like to understand what is the both sides of the issue. And then after that, the fellow community members, according with the merit of the arguments, it should prevail, not the decision made outside. That we have to start very careful handling the community board, because we can still having many, many problems. And the best way is Robert rules. Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara Rutter.
First of all, I just want to say that when I mentioned health, I didn't mean it to be controversial. I'm a believer in task force for very large projects. There's been so many of them, and they have been very successful, and they've been successful. And partially because what we've had sometimes is different committees looking at the same thing. It's like the elephant. Are you looking at the tail, or you're looking at the nose, or whatever? And they've come with different resolutions, and it's been ridiculous and conflicting. So that was my comment and nothing more. I do have a question for Russell. If you're saying the status quo is not working well because of just what I'm saying. The zoning committee comes with a resolution. We have a different resolution at land use. Zoning has one person, land use has somebody else. And I find I come away frustrated, I think, and I'm not alone. I speak to people, and I know there's one group that may think one way, but it's very frustrating. So are you saying there won't be a land use committee? And to answer that, and the third thing I'm just going to say is the land use committee, from all the years I've been on, it's not as long as many of the others have been on, but the chair is the chair of the community board, not Russell or Alita or Chuck, but the person that's chair of the community board is the chair of land use, because they have connections, and it doesn't mean that they don't rely on people with more expertise. They are the ones that have the ear of the borough president and can easily get the elected official. And I think we would have more success at that point. So are you talking about, I don't understand, Russell, what you're talking about status quo. I don't believe you mean exactly status quo, but am I wrong? Can I get an answer for that?
Sure. So, I think what people have described, and I think the way it's sort of worked recently is, and I guess maybe to take the blood center as an example and sort of how that's going, basically the Zoning and Development Committee looked at that issue over the course of a number of months. And then it's ultimately going to come to the Land Use Committee once it gets certified. And we'll look at it there. And I think, I'm sure there'll be a fair amount of discussion, although, it is something that the board's already taken a position on. So maybe the discussion won't be as lengthy as it otherwise might be, but basically, so it doesn't mean that the Land Use Committee, doesn't operate. As it currently is now, the Land Use Committee has a lot to do and, does a lot on these things. And basically, I think the view is that, if you have multiple committees looking at these things, and if something gets looked at in the Zoning and Development Committee, and then it also gets looked at in the Land Use Committee, that's basically people are fine with that. And the upshot of it is it just means more review, and that's not really the worst thing in the world. And so I think basically that's what people are describing.
And I don't think there will be any conflicts with the blood center. I can't imagine anybody that's against it, but I may be wrong. I'm sorry, that's for it. That's against what our resolution was.
Yeah, I'm hoping that can be actually a short portion of that meeting. We can sort of talk more about that.
Conflicts, and therefore there'll be different resolutions, and we've had problems with that in the past in various things, not necessarily land use, but where different committees came with conflicting resolutions at times. And
well, I guess, I think if there are conflicting resolutions, I think, ultimately it's the full board that has to vote on everything, right? And so the full board isn't going to, or presumably isn't going to sort of contradict itself. And once, all these things are coming to the full board can decide the stuff. And I think, the potential for this being an issue is there. And that's why I thought it was a potential issue. But I think it basically, people don't feel like it's that, the potential for problems there are all that significant, and that sort of the way it's been going is people are happy with, and if it means we have to sort of muddle through at times, then we do it. And that's just sort of what that's I feel like my takeaway from basically what most people have said. It's not the view of everybody, but I think that's how I am kind of reading the room in terms of what most people's views are. So that's you know, and that was the purpose of the discussion, frankly, was basically to say that, you know, here's this issue. What do people think about it? And I think that's how most people feel.
May I suggest that it's written up so that we have because this is a very different zoning committee that I knew for all of those years, and I think acted in all those years. Is it possible to write up exactly what each role is and maybe a discussion with the full board so that there wouldn't be this confusion? I
think the issue there, I mean, we've never really done that with respect to any of our committees. I mean, I think it's been, and you know, I think for all of the, I think the reason for that basically is, my view is, I think I would be hesitant to sort of define too rigidly what one is doing and not, or whatever. And I actually think by defining it, you're potentially creating more potential for conflict between committees than otherwise, if you're going to try and anticipate ahead of time what every different kind of issue is or whatever. So that's not something that we've done in the past. I think if we were to, I don't see a way we could do it with regard to, you know, some committees and not others. And so once you're sort of like talking about a sort of rigid description of what the committees do, I think you're sort of opening up into this much larger project of having to do that for all of the committees, which I'm not sure is something that we really want to get into. And I think in particular, if what people like is the way it operates currently, then it seems to me that there's less need of all for any kind of sort of additional action to change it.
Okay. We do have a write-up on committees, by the way. I remember writing up some. I haven't done it in a few years.
We have the descriptions on the website. I mean, and that's, you know, I think that provides some guidance. And obviously, ultimately, all of this is sort of guided by precedent, and precedent evolves. And, you know, I think that's basically how it tends to work.
Anthony?
I was actually uncharacteristically going to make a motion to adjourn. I see there are a couple of other people who want to speak, but
the motion to adjourn is always in order. If there's a second, I see a second. So and it's not really debatable. So why don't we have Rebecca, since you're call the roll here, or go through your usual calling of the roll in these circumstances?
Well, since there's no item up for a vote, I guess I could say if you object, you could raise your hand, but I would close just by thanking everyone for coming. And Chuck, Taina, I don't know if you want to add anything.
No, I think it's been a good discussion, and I think, as you said, if people object to adjourning, they ought to raise their hand. Otherwise, we'll consider it we are adjourned.
Yep, nothing to add here. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone. Appreciate.
Have a great evening, everyone. Thank you.
Appreciate everyone's time. Bye-bye.